My name is John Wallach. I'm a professor of political science at Hunter College in the Graduate Center, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for this evening, Roger Smith, professor of political science. Well, there's more about him that I'll talk about in a second. Professor of political science at University of Pennsylvania. Now, on your program, you have some true facts about Professor Smith, about his institutional affiliation, an indication of his extensive record of publications, just some of his honors. There's even a picture of him so that you can know that the person giving the lecture correlates well with the well-deserved accolades mentioned in the program. Finally, there's the title of his lecture, Conflicting Visions of Citizenship in the Trump Years, and a brief description of what it will concern. But I want to take a couple of minutes to tell you a bit more about Professor Smith. I'll ignore mentioning his secret affiliations with Breitbart News, his offshore tax havens, and his failed attempt to sell his name as a brand for choreography to the North Korean government, because none of that is true. Instead, I'd like to take a few minutes to whet your appetite for this lecture, for I am certain that, as one person who knows Rogers fairly well recently said, you'll get your money's worth. But insofar as you haven't spent any money, that might not be sufficiently reassuring. So I wanted to say a few more words. First, I want you to know that Rogers is in his 60s, not his 40s. He's been known to fool people about his age. But more importantly, I want you to know that Rogers really is a wrestler. No, not the kind of wrestler who beats his breast as part of a comedic theater, or who participates in the great sport that still is practiced skillfully by many high school athletes, or even as a biblical Jacobin who wrestles with angels or devils. No, Professor Smith is an intellectual wrestler, one who wrestles with the contradictions, ambiguities, and promise of American politics, its record of shameful injustices, and until recently, its character as a haven for those in need and who want to start new lives, who honor the words of the Statue of Liberty, not venal attempts to inflate self and power. One might say, importing language from another humanistic discipline, his work shows the generative power of guilt. But since his first book, published in the late 1980s, Liberalism and American Constitutional Law, to his unparalleled award-winning interpretation of the deep significance of laws concerning citizenship in the United States for America's political identity, the 1997 book Civic Ideals, Conflicting Values of Citizenship in U.S. History, the subtitle of which indicates we're not going to hear a pumped-up op-ed tonight, to his original and fascinating account of narratives of peoplehood as major factors in the political lives of nations all across the globe, Stories of Peoplehood, The Politics and Morals of Political Membership, published in 2003, to finally his co-authored books on citizenship and consent, and racial equality and inequality in America, not to mention other books that he has edited or co-edited. Roger Smith has wrestled with the cross-currents of American political identity, of what being American means, as a badge of pride and shame that we need to know and work through if we are to become a better people, which he believes lies within our power. Rogers has deftly woven together political theory, history, and politics in knowledgeable, persuasive ways that have informed the way Americans see themselves. So there is no better individual I can imagine than Roger Smith to give our second biannual lecture of the New York Area Faculty Seminar on Political Theory, sponsored by Roosevelt House, the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, and the Department of Political Science. No better time to give it than amid this critical time in American political life, when our historic political institutions, carefully crafted public policies, and the lives of hundreds of millions of people, of hundreds of millions of unimaginably diverse individuals are being, what shall I say here, ignorantly toyed with by a calculating, careless showman, or maybe, I'm not sure. Anyways, he's the president of the United States. But fortunately, Professor Smith has more self-restraint than the man who's just about finished introducing him. and who has had the good fortune of knowing Rogers, admiring his work and character, and liking him for over 35 years. So you will not hear a shrill condemnation of the current presidential administration, but a probing, thoughtful account of the challenges Americans now face in dealing with their changing laws, politics, and lives. So without further ado, I have the distinct honor and high privilege of handing over the podium to Professor Rogers M. Smith, who will speak for about 45 minutes on the topic Conflicting Visions of American Citizenship in the Trump Years. After his talk, I will open a general discussion by flooring him with a few questions, continuing the wrestling analogy, and then helping him up to address brief questions and comments from, as we say in Brooklyn, yous. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm delighted and honored to be here tonight. As you've just heard, my scholarship has long focused on, or perhaps I should now say wrestled with, conflicting visions of American citizenship and American identity more broadly. So as a scholar, I was fascinated by that dramatic moment on January 20th, when President Donald Trump turned his back on the Washington leaders assembled on stage behind him, including 4 former presidents from both parties, and condemned the whole Washington establishment as a self-rewarding few who had produced American carnage, afflicting most citizens. He accused the nation's leaders of benefiting foreign industries and countries instead of our own. And then he announced, from this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first, America first. Undoubtedly influenced by his chief political strategist, Steve Bannon, Trump elaborated this America first vision by saying that we will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we do so with the understanding that it's the right of all nations to put their own interests first. We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example. At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. Now, Trump was opposed by most Republican primary voters, and he also lost the popular vote in the November election by nearly 3 million votes, even as the Democrats actually gained seats in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. But it is a very serious mistake to underestimate the appeal of this nationalist vision, which, though newly formulated by Trump and Bannon, has deep roots in American life, and which today has reinforcing counterparts in resurgent nationalisms in many parts of the modern world. With similar goals, the United Kingdom is exiting the European Union. Kindred support for stridently nationalist anti-immigrant parties is rising in France, Denmark, and throughout much of Europe and the world, in those nations where such parties are not already in command. Despite some counterexamples, it is hard not to fear that late 20th century dreams of cohesive, multicultural democratic nations may be dying, succumbing to angry, authoritarian, exclusionary nationalisms in much of the world. For some liberal and left scholars and activists, the answer is to redouble attacks on the whole Westphalian ideal of a world of sovereign nation states as an increasingly archaic structure of political and economic power and institution that inherently breeds chauvinism and inequality. These scholars seek to win support for more democratic, federated, and cosmopolitan forms of political community. To others, the lesson is that identity politics inevitably backfires, so that progressive forces should minimize multicultural schools and focus on economic concerns. There is truth in both responses. But at this historical moment, and perhaps for decades to come, I think it is still necessary for those who seek to win authority to shape national policies in progressive directions in America and elsewhere to build coalitions on shared accounts of national identities and purposes, what I have called national stories of peoplehood. The Israeli-American political scientist David Ricci, who shares this view, has recently argued that modern liberals do not tell and perhaps cannot tell compelling national narratives that can compete with conservative visions like Trump's. Liberal commitments to diversity and rationalism mean that mostly liberals simply offer laundry lists of policy proposals that are at best loosely grounded in what Ricci calls alpha stories of national identity. I understand his analysis. For the same reasons, I've often felt inhibited defending any single narrative of American peoplehood as most authoritative. But now, I think I was wrong. There is a story of American national identity that deserves recognition as our best story of who we are and what we as a people are trying to achieve. It is a story that shows why a vision of only America first is very remote from the best that Americans are and can be as a people. That story, derived from the anti-slavery constitutionalists of America's antebellum era, will be my main focus tonight. But I believe that there are counterpart arguments to be made in many nations around the world, though given my parochial limitations, I can only elaborate this argument in regard to the United States. Still, at the most general level, the directions the argument proposes are pertinent to similar challenges faced by proponents of multicultural national identities in many lands. Pursuit of that direction involves 5 steps. First, the development out of nations' particular traditions of stories of peoplehood that articulate normatively desirable national identities and purposes. Second, the recognition that insofar as these stories incorporate commitments to human rights as checks on chauvinistic impulses, policies must work to ensure that persons have resources that make their possession of those rights meaningful, not merely formal. Third, there should be acceptance that policies that can work to include and assist all members of a multicultural nation must often treat different groups differently, and that political communities must continually decide which differentiations serve these goals and which inflict unjust inequalities. Fourth, we need the propagation of a civic ethos that supports narratives of egalitarian inclusiveness by prompting citizens and nations to think not only of how they can avoid harm to others, but how they can realize their own goals in ways that do most to assist others. And fifth, we need to create and implement policies that express these national commitments. Those policies must promote both economic welfare and cultural recognition for all. And provocatively, I'll suggest they should include some accommodations, exemptions, and aid for those drawn to exclusionary nationalisms because they feel their cultural and economic interests are being disregarded or assaulted, though there should be no acquiescing in exclusionary or subordinating practices. This argument is premised on 2 beliefs. First, that a truly transnational cosmopolitan politics is not viable in most parts of the world today, whether or not it is desirable. And second, that stories of peoplehood that feature only economic themes without expressly addressing multicultural concerns are also not likely either to be politically compelling or fully just. These premises mean that the pursuit of these steps must begin with each nation's own distinctive political and moral traditions, and that the paths progressives must follow will vary in different locales, even if they move toward the same general ends. But although the United States is but one of many instances, it is a vital test case for this argument. Millions of Americans have considered themselves part of a providentially chosen people ever since John Winthrop assured the 17th century Puritans that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The remarkable success of the once thinly populated, poor, and backward British American colonies in becoming first an independent nation, then a thriving one, then the world's largest industrial economy, then by the middle of the 20th century, the world's greatest military power, persuaded many more millions of Americans along the way that their nation was indeed exceptional. Yet also along the way, many Americans came to see their nation as not only most favored by God, but as the leading bearer of a superior white patriarchal identity. Whether or not Trump supporters consciously see themselves as proponents of white nationalism, There can be no doubt that for many of the most fervent, their vote to make America great again was a vote to restore much of what they took an earlier, undeniably more predominantly white, more male-governed, and more predominantly Christian America to be like. Precisely because America's rise to global prominence has long made claims for its greatness as a white Christian nation credible, this kind of chauvinistic nationalism has proven stubbornly resilient. For just that reason, if we can identify conceptions of democratic multicultural national identity that can compete effectively in America, those conceptions may be guides to how progressive patriots can forge similar ones in other settings. In the wake of the 2016 election, the sources of assaults on politically correct multicultural conceptions of American identity, including Donald Trump's challenges to Barack Obama's citizenship and his harsh criticisms of Mexican and Muslim immigrants, have been widely dissected. There's little doubt that many of the phenomena commonly lumped together as forms of globalization, including international trade agreements, labor immigration, new transnational regulatory institutions, and policies conferring privileges on multinational corporations, have fostered economic anxieties and resentments among many Native workers, not only those who have lost their jobs or endured stagnant wages. As in many other lands, the same trends have also made many older stock Americans feel they are losing the political power to shape their nation's destiny. New immigrants, large corporations, and foreign agencies seem increasingly in command. But in the U.S. and many other countries, these economic anxieties and feelings of diminishing capacities for political self-determination are intertwined with concerns that nations' distinctive ethnocultural identities are also endangered, due to the increased presence and rising status of residents who identify with religions, languages, racial and ethnic groups, and cultural traditions that differ from the ones that have long predominated in those nations. To endure, political communities must achieve solidarity-sustaining senses of trust and worth between their members and between their members and their leaders. Recent experience raises doubts that countries can do so only if leaders offer their members economic security, personal safety, and some measure of participation, however vicarious, in political power. Though countries must do these things more than many are doing now. But populations must also embrace, and their institutions and policies must largely embody and express narratives of community identity that I have called constitutive. These are stories that link aspects of a community's identity presented as intrinsically valuable to members' own identities and aspirations. The stories can be religious myths of chosen peoplehood or historical tales of a nation's military glory or political greatness or celebrations of a people's intellectual and artistic products or other sources of national distinction in which members can proudly share. Usually, these stories include venerations for a nation's founders. Sometimes these odes to ancestral greatness buttress claims to intrinsic racial or ethnic superiority. It will therefore immediately be obvious that such constitutive themes are often central to narrow chauvinistic forms of nationalism, the kinds rightly raising concerns in many countries today. It is understandable that proponents of humanitarian moralities have sought to find ways to build political communities that largely set these kinds of stories aside. Many have preferred to stress, like both John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, that to be just, modern nations must center their identities on political commitments to constitutional democracy and human rights, with accounts of distinctive ethnocultural identities confined to decidedly secondary statuses. Yet it is also not hard to understand why many have questioned whether these purely civic conceptions of national identity can compete politically with the passions and commitments aroused by more ethnic ones, especially when, as today, the latter are fueled by fears of loss of economic and political status. Proponents of the European Union have struggled to articulate a story of European peoplehood that can inspire allegiance. In the case of many Brexit voters, they failed. Apart from the embattled Angela Merkel, most Northern European national leaders have in recent years felt compelled to distance themselves from strong multicultural policies lest they appear insufficiently patriotic and become targets of fierce movements to, quote, take our country back. The evidence that 21st century states embracing principles of constitutionalism, democracy, and human rights still need distinctive stories of what makes their particular peoplehood valuable continues to mount. The issue then becomes how, at least for now, can nations elaborate constitutive stories of their particular valuable national identities that avoid the evils of chauvinistic nationalisms and capture many of the benefits of multicultural communities and transnational associations? Can they, in fact, do so at all? There are options worth exploring in America and elsewhere. To grasp the case for them, some review of the history of the idea of America as a superior white Christian nation and the alternatives that have competed with it in American experience may help. Most scholars recognize that the Europeans who first founded North American colonies regarded themselves as religiously and culturally superior to the non-Europeans they encountered. The colonists thought this superiority justified their taking of land from indigenous peoples and their imposition of chattel slavery on especially workers of African descent. After the American revolutionaries gained independence and then a constitution, their first Congress legislated in 1790 that to be naturalized, a person had to be white, a term that initially was just shorthand for being of European descent. Congress's action then showed that at the birth of the American nation and long thereafter, the idea that most, if not all, Americans should be European descended or white was widely accepted among those who deemed themselves white. But it was only as the 19th century proceeded that insistence on the idea that America was a white man's nation came to be a common theme in political discourse, buttressed by new inegalitarian racial sciences and religious doctrines. As contestation over slavery and expansionism heightened, many came to argue explicitly, as Stephen Douglas did in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, that, quote, this government of ours is founded on the white basis. It was made by the white man for the benefit of the white man to be administered by white men. Douglas proclaimed himself, quote, opposed to taking any step that recognizes the Negro man or the Indian as the equal of the white man, equality they never should have, either political or social or in any other respect whatever. Chief Justice Roger Taney tried to write this vision of America into constitutional law in the 1857 Dred Scott case when the Supreme Court held that no one of African descent could be a United States citizen. But in these years, leading abolitionists, including Lysander Spooner and Frederick Douglass, building on the rhetoric of earlier radicals like Francis Wright, began elaborating narratives of the American nation as dedicated to a quest to realize the promises of the Declaration of Independence for all over time. Abraham Lincoln and the new Republican Party came to champion this story against the Democrats of Douglas and Taney in the 1850s and 1860s. Lincoln called the Declaration's promise a maxim set up for future use that should be, in his words, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and so constantly spreading and deepening its influence, thereby augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Toward the end of his life, and indeed at the cost of his life, Lincoln came to accept that this pursuit meant extending voting rights to some African Americans. And after his death, his party wrote principles of racial equality, including equal economic, political, and juridical rights, into the Constitution and into new federal civil rights statutes. And they created new federal agencies, including the Freedmen's Bureau, to administer new educational, legal aid, and land redistribution policies that might enable African Americans to gain meaningful, not merely formal possession of those rights, though many of their efforts were stymied by President Andrew Johnson's vetoes and resistance. Still, the idea of America as a white nation was far from dead. Many white Americans resisted these racially egalitarian and inclusive innovations. Through decades of intense conflict, the nation built new systems of racial hierarchy in the form of Jim Crow systems of segregation, jury exclusion, and disfranchisement. Yet at the same time, as the late 19th century Industrial Revolution produced unprecedented heights of economic inequality, democratizing economic and social movements formed, from greenbackers to labor unions to populists to progressives, and eventually, after the Depression, to Franklin Roosevelt's New Dealers. The New Deal brought to dominance a new idea of America that portrayed the nation as a consumers and workers democracy, one bonded above all by a common concern for material progress to be achieved through a centrally regulated market economy in which democratic governments would provide countervailing power to the immense resources that financial and manufacturing enterprises could wield. Segregation and white nationalism persisted, but began to lose support. Then, the post-World War II rise of global competition with communist nations led to a domestic discrediting of left-leaning economic views and of labor unions, as embodied in the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act. The early New Deal's consumers and workers democracy vision of America increasingly narrowed into a more conservative consumers democracy that eventually became an anti-labor, anti-welfare, neoliberal orthodoxy shared by many in both major parties. But all along, African Americans and their allies struggled against Jim Crow policies and practices and their legacies. Often they found the anti-slavery story of America as dedicated to securing the rights of the Declaration of Independence for all a vital resource in their struggles. In the 1950s and 1960s, prodded by domestic protests and by the fact that Jim Crow measures were a huge Cold War liability for America, the U.S. finally formally repudiated racial segregation and disfranchisement and began to redeem the promise of the post-Civil War amendments. Those successes, limited though they were, helped inspire the modern women's movement, and a host of other civil rights struggles on behalf of religious, cultural, and linguistic minorities, non-white immigrants, disabled persons, LGBTQ Americans, and more. Many began speaking of the modern United States as simply one of a growing number of multicultural and civic nations, though just what that meant was and remains disputed. One reason is that up through the mid-1960s, struggles for equal civil rights were primarily articulated by their defenders and opponents as struggles for uniformity in citizenship laws. They were presented as struggles to end invidious discriminations by making America more colorblind, more gender blind, and more difference blind. They were efforts to end forms of second-class citizenship by providing for all Americans identical bundles of rights and duties. But those bundles often had a content that to many less advantaged Americans did not seem blind at all. Full citizenship remained largely defined by the rights, duties, and ways of life that most middle-class, heterosexual, religious white men possessed and pursued, or in the case of the duties, sometimes just professed to pursue. And the half-century since the major civil rights laws of the 1960s were passed has seen the burgeoning of a range of civic phenomena that narratives of rights movements as struggles for difference blindness would not lead us to expect. They represent efforts to realize civic equality not through uniformity, but through appropriately differentiated citizenship, with different bundles of rights and duties assigned, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, to different groups of citizens, based on distinctive features of their identities, such as those of racial and ethnic and linguistic minorities, religious communities, immigrant communities, the disabled, women, non-heterosexuals, the very young, and the very old. The core argument put forth by many advocates for all these groups is that public policies generally reflect the values and interests of economically, culturally, and politically powerful communities, particularly America's affluent white men, not the values and interests of all. The result is that the public policies and practices impose uniform treatment on all and fail to accommodate many differences. They will not produce meaningful equality of rights and opportunities. Instead, American laws and practices will, through their very uniformity, unjustly privilege some already highly advantaged citizens at the expense of all others, maintaining in substance, if not in rhetorical form, the idea of America as a white man's nation. This debate over whether treating individual groups identically without regard to their differences is really the right way to treat them equally has a long history. The debate includes the disputes among early 20th century women's rights advocates about whether protective labor laws aided or hindered the progress of women, The claims of Jehovah's Witnesses at mid-century that they were being denied equal religious freedom if their children were required, like all others, to salute the American flag at school, as well as the long-standing debates amongst diverse African-American leaders about whether black nationalist initiatives or demands for integration were the best ways to combat the ills of Jim Crow, amongst other examples. Today, this debate between equality as uniformity and equality as appropriately differentiated treatment is most commonly identified with controversies over racial affirmative action programs. But it's wrong to identify calls for different but equal citizenship rights simply with racial affirmative action or even with modern liberal positions. Americans across the political spectrum favor some forms of differentiated citizenship, even though the specific forms they favor vary greatly. For example, most Americans regard young children as citizens, and if they have earnings, children often pay taxes, unlike some rich adults. But few urge that small children should be given voting rights like adult citizens. Most Americans believe that some special accommodations for disabled persons in public institutions, such as being allowed extra time on standardized school and job tests, are both fair and desirable, even though this gives them opportunities that other citizens do not have. Similarly, many think it is fine to allow all persons over 65 to ride free on public transit, as they do in Philadelphia, regardless of their income, even as younger people must pay. Most importantly for this argument, many conservatives today argue fiercely that traditionalist religious believers who direct businesses or nonprofits should generally have their faiths accommodated through granting them special exemptions from requirements to assist employees in obtaining medical coverage that includes contraceptives. Many say these believers should also receive exemptions from duties to serve GLBTQ members of the public, and that religious groups should be able to retain tax-exempt status even while campaigning for candidates, relieving them of what are now legal obligations for everyone else. So, in 21st century America, if we look for beliefs that public policies should treat at least some individuals and groups differently from other citizens in order to make them equal citizens in reality, we find that such beliefs are so widespread as to be nearly universal. These beliefs are so common in part because the notion that equality means universally uniform treatment, while appealing in the abstract, has always had implications that many have rejected, albeit for varied reasons. But advocacy of equality as appropriate differentiation has become far more prevalent today as a consequence of the partial triumphs of the civil rights movements through the 1960s. The laws then enacted failed to produce rapid material progress for many long discriminated against Americans, leading to calls for racial affirmative action programs. But that is only part of the story, and not the larger part. The major story is the increased ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity in the U.S. wrought by the 1965 Immigration Act, which ended the race-based national origins quota system created in the 1920s. And the other part of the story is the mounting resistance of many white older stock Americans to that diversity. Ronald Reagan was able to lead the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s because he added to the economic and military conservatives, to whom he had chiefly appealed in the 1960s, new advocacy on behalf of racial and religious conservatives. Most racial conservatives of the 1970s and 1980s had abandoned overt support for legal segregation, but they fiercely opposed all measures that explicitly redistributed resources toward racial and ethnic minorities. There's little doubt, especially after Trump's triumph, that many of those racial conservatives saw and still see policies aiding racial and ethnic minorities as threats to a predominantly white-governed America, which they continue to believe to be America at its best. And after the failure of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act to stem the migrant tide, racial conservatives also denounced Latino immigrants for similar reasons. Religious conservatives have also long been terrified that federal civil rights policies would lead to their losing tax exemptions and other public benefits provided to their organizations, since they were reluctant to embrace gender equality, in some cases to become racially inclusive, and in most cases to recognize LGBTQ rights. These racial and religious conservative constituencies, added to the economic and military conservative base of the Republican Party, made the GOP predominant in American politics from 1980 through 2008 and kept hope alive for those who believed in a predominantly white-led America. At the same time, they fostered a heightening ideological polarization of the leadership of the two major parties, with the Republicans in particular moving strongly to the right. That polarization only became more severe as more moderate Republican leaders failed to resist many of the demographic and cultural transformations that the GOP's new racial and religious constituencies abhorred. Instead, most GOP and Democratic establishment leaders embraced neoliberal policies of economic globalization, including free trade and continuing immigration, which made many in these constituencies feel vulnerable to heightened foreign competition, economic, but also cultural. The results of this heightened polarization included governmental gridlock on many national issues over the past decade. That gridlock fostered popular dissatisfactions that fed strong insurgent campaigns in both parties during 2016, and the capture of the presidency by a man whose electoral base lies more with the racial and religious conservatives than with economic and military conservatives, whose free trade and foreign interventionist positions he has challenged even as he joins them on other issues. Though Trump and most of his supporters disavow explicit white nationalism, the election energized alt-right leaders like Richard Spencer, who soon proclaimed, echoing Stephen Douglas, "America was, until the last generation, a white country designed for ourselves and our posterity. It is our creation, it is our inheritance, and it belongs to us." President Trump contends his America First vision is broader, demanding total allegiance to the United States of America and thereby leaving, quote, "no room for prejudice." But it also leaves no room for any suspected of lacking such total allegiance, or those who find America First too narrow a vision to help us meet global challenges. That's why it's imperative for liberals and progressives to embrace a more expansive conception of American national identity that can compete with Trump's brand of nationalism. There are no surefire answers, but the 5 general steps noted at the outset, contextually elaborated in light of America's history and traditions, seems worth considering. The first component is to develop from the materials of American history a story of the nation's core purposes that makes greater egalitarian inclusiveness over time not a threat, but rather a basic commitment. It must be a story that most Americans recognize not only as deeply constitutive of their national identity, but as the best story of who they are and what America should be. That best story is the compelling account of American peoplehood advanced by the antebellum critics of slavery to combat the most strident accounts of America as a white nation in U.S. history. Americans should see the task of realizing the goals of the Declaration of Independence as, in Lincoln's words, the apple of gold at the center of the Constitution's silver frame, the heart of what Americans seek to achieve. Though Lincoln and most other tellers of this tale agree that it is appropriate for American citizens to make the security of these rights for themselves and their posterity their first priority, as Trump argues, still, the Declaration of Independence rights are human rights. So they define a still grander goal through which Americans seek to contribute over time, both to their own enjoyment of these rights and insofar as they can, to like progress in all the world, undoubtedly, gradually, largely perhaps by example, but with a firm dedication to benefiting all people of all colors everywhere. But simply retelling this story as it's been told in the past is not enough. The major limitations to conceiving of national purposes in this way cannot be ignored. It's far from clear that Lincoln and others were not partly engaged in myth-making when they attributed this goal to the framers. But it's also true that if it began as myth, this story of who Americans are and what they are seeking to achieve has since been embodied in the post-Civil War amendments and widely embraced by both major parties as well as many social movements. It provides a more morally inspiring sense of the intrinsic worth of American peoplehood than primarily economic accounts favored by many centrist and left critics of multicultural ideas. It can be turned to many different political purposes, and that is a challenge, but it is also a source of its coalition-building potential. In recent years, this story has been consciously carried forward with different inflections in the second inaugural of George W. Bush, who said that advancing these ideals, securing the rights of every man and woman on this earth, is the mission that created our nation. And the second inaugural of Barack Obama, who said that what makes us American is our allegiance to an idea articulated in a declaration made more than 2 centuries ago, an idea that placed Americans on a never-ending journey through Seneca Falls and Selma and Stonewall, as they have sought to bridge the meaning of those words with the realities of our time. In fact, this story of Americans has joined in pursuit of a mission defined in the Declaration of Independence has at times been embraced by adherents of both major parties, by conservatives, liberals, and many radicals, by a wide range of religious believers and secularists, and by the native-born and the foreign-born alike. Yet it is a story that was not prominent in the rhetoric of either candidate in the wrenching 2016 presidential campaign. No other story seems likely to do as much to help us move beyond current divisions. Still, for many modern progressives, invoking this sense of American identity sounds several alarms. It may lead Americans to be obsessed with claiming rights for themselves as individuals instead of pursuing common goods. Or Americans may rest satisfied with a formal equality of rights that belies a crippling inequality of conditions. Or they may use claims to be protecting rights to impose on diverse populations at home and abroad self-interested mainstream American conceptions of how others should live. These concerns have force. They suggest Americans must significantly expand upon the Civil War Republicans' understanding of what securing meaningful rights for all entails. As the intertwined history of modern labor and civil rights struggles has long since shown, policies and practices must help people acquire the economic, educational, and political resources and capabilities they need to exercise their rights. What policies and practices will work to do so? Which will, in particular, aid constituencies who feel economically and culturally endangered by globalizing trends, as well as aiding the deeply disadvantaged? All the deeply disadvantaged? Americans disagree sharply on policies, particularly in regard to redistribution, public investment, and direct public provision of services. Lincoln favored state investment in public roads and highways, public schools, charities, and orphanages, as well as the administration of criminal and civil justice systems, along with all other things that he said people, quote, cannot do at all or cannot so well do for themselves. That list of government interventions goes too far for some today, but almost all Americans favor some of these public programs, so despite disagreements on others, most recognize that, or can be brought to recognize, that we're engaged in a common endeavor to make not just formal rights, but the secure enjoyment of rights available to all, including both those in economic need and those culturally marginalized. So if national prosperity can be advanced by expanded trade and immigration policies, the imperative to make sure all residents still have real prospects of pursuing happiness means that Congress should channel this prosperity toward national aid to citizens and communities that lose jobs and feel overwhelmed by demands for expanded social services due to the consequences of trade and immigration. The best opportunity for such policies now is public infrastructure spending on construction of transportation, communications, education, and energy production systems, accompanied by environmental protections. These investments could generate employment for displaced native workers and immigrants alike, while spurring sustained economic growth that could advance the pursuits of happiness of all for decades to come. But we must also always recognize that powerful groups have often prompted American governments to pursue their interest and to impose their ways of life on minorities at home and other political societies abroad. And remember that the Declaration of Independence rights include the pursuit of happiness, and people's notions of happiness legitimately vary, as do the social, economic, and political barriers they face. To be effective, policies seeking to enable all to enjoy their basic rights securely, therefore, cannot treat all persons in strictly uniform fashion. So this argument implies that the U.S., like other modern democracies, must engage in continuing, changing contextual judgments about what forms of differential treatment of groups and identities, what forms of aid and accommodation will augment the happiness and value of life for all concerned, And what forms of differential treatment will instead foster divisions, inequalities, and injustices? Given human diversity, the idea of America as a nation dedicated to securing rights to pursue happiness for all leads inexorably to the idea of America as a multicultural nation. But it is an idea of a multicultural America that sees itself not as fundamentally divided, but rather as building on the best aspects of its common heritage to engage in a shared enterprise that benefits all. Even so, the answers as to what forms of differentiated citizenship are desirable will rarely, if ever, be incontestable, and the answers will change as social, economic, and political contexts change. Auto workers in Flint, Michigan did not need opportunities for work in public infrastructure construction projects or retraining and relocation programs in the 1950s when the American auto industry dominated world markets. But today, those investments should be part of ensuring former auto workers are included in the nation's quest to secure rights to pursue happiness for all. Conversely, Catholics were an oppressed minority, deserving accommodations in public education policies in the 1840s, when Protestants in Philadelphia demanded that Protestant Bibles be used in public schools and rioted violently against Catholics who objected. Catholics in the U.S. have much less claim to be oppressed today, and so their claims for accommodations should be more limited. But both these examples show that hard questions of appropriately differentiated policies are ones to which we can find answers based on good empirical evidence of current social, economic, and political conditions and practices, and good studies of what the likely consequences of different policy options are. Even so, for citizens to decide well, Americans need to develop a civic ethos that encourages all to pursue, amongst the diverse forms of happiness they may seek individually and as a nation, those forms that are most valuable to others as well as to themselves, in part because those choices do most to permit and sometimes assist others in pursuing their distinctive forms of happiness. Pragmatically persuasive as my arguments may be, they can still seem like a call for us to be unprincipled and unjust, to decide on a shifting and ad hoc basis to treat some people better than others instead of respecting all as equals. To respond to this concern, I offer this suggestion. Many modern political societies professing liberal democratic principles have defined the justice they seek to establish in terms of the harm principle of John Stuart Mill. He contended that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Modern Millians often wisely fear that these harms will be defined in terms of the ethnocentric definitions of civilized communities that Mill himself often endorsed. Consequently, they adapt Mill's harm principle along lines like those of the 19th century American philosopher and anti-slavery advocate Ralph Waldo Emerson. Today, it's more customary to suggest that each person is entitled to the maximum amount of self-defined freedom and self-realization possible, consistent with the self-defined freedom and self-realization of others, rather than invoking the standards of civilized communities. But this turn to protection of self-defined freedoms raises the danger that persons pursuing different forms of self-realization will clash far more than they cooperate. That's why a new civic ethos is needed and possible. In the diverse America of the 21st century, we've come to recognize ourselves as complex, multiply constituted beings who might seek satisfying forms of self-realization in many ways, ways that while they would provide roughly equal satisfaction for us, might have very different consequences for others. It is right and good for us to feel obliged to take those consequences into account, individually and as a nation. So I previously suggested that Americans and members of other societies should adopt a further modified Millian maxim as both a personal and a civic ethos. That modified maxim is the best uses of their powers by communities and individuals are those that aid others without doing harm to themselves, both to meet our own needs and goals and to do what is just and good for our fellow citizens in the 21st century. We need to focus not only on preventing harm to others. To be sure, concerns to combat harms, including disabling forms of discrimination and subordination, must remain central, and what constitutes harm will always be contested. But we can still strive to exercise our freedoms individually and as a nation in ways that actually benefit others, not just ourselves. Doing so means we should recognize that it's right and good to support giving some accommodations and exemptions to others, because doing so will work no real harm to ourselves while we enable those persons to pursue happiness as they define it more successfully and in ways that are more practically equal to our own opportunities. This view of justice leads to my last suggestion. Legislators and executives devising public policies and courts adjudicating them should apply this modified Millian maxim when responding to the claims of the wide range of advocates for special exemptions and accommodations, including religious groups, linguistic, cultural, ethnic, and racial minorities, the disabled, women, LGBTQ persons and groups, children, the elderly, and more. Rather than regarding all differential treatment as suspect, as is often the case now, American lawmakers and courts should reverse the burden of proof. They should only reject the claims of groups to special accommodations when those denials are necessary to achieve compelling governmental purposes, purposes which must be more than simple hostility to the groups in question and which must not include any allegiance to the idea of America as a white Christian nation or even a nation that demands total allegiance. And let me make it clear, to be truly just, as well to be truly multicultural and widely acceptable, these efforts at appropriate accommodations must include concerns for traditional conservative groups, as well as new immigrants and cultural communities. That position may give pause even to conservatives who fear the loss of shared cultural values through differential treatment. It certainly concerns moderates devoted to the rule of law and progressives who fear that powerful groups will win accommodations that only heighten American inequalities. These fears cannot be lightly dismissed. Note, however, that if we accept that each group and individual should have rights that have comparable value to, but that are not more valuable than those granted to other groups and individuals, then we may frequently find that denials of demands for special rights and accommodations are justified by compelling state interests. Once accommodations are provided to any one group, they must be provided to all groups who similarly claim those accommodations are vital to their pursuits of happiness. So both legislators and courts must ask what the consequences will be, for example, of granting exemptions from public health programs, whatever they may turn out to be, exemptions from legal requirements, not only to conservative religious groups and to corporations owned by small groups of religious believers, but to all entities who make similar demands. If there are many such bodies, then the accommodations in total may be too costly, both in dollars and in terms of their impacts on other public goals, to be acceptable. Similarly, if we permit religious groups to endorse political candidates, as President Trump has urged, we must allow all tax-exempt advocacy groups to endorse candidates. We cannot grant religious traditionalists full political speech rights and tax exemptions while denying one or the other to environmental and animal rights advocacy groups. So, a policy of extensive exemptions and permitting political campaigning might prove unsustainable, both politically and fiscally, quieting pressures for change. But if demands for accommodations really are confined to a small number of groups, businesses, and individuals, while the interests of those adversely affected by accommodations can be met through relatively costless alternative policies, such as perhaps the provision of access to contraceptives by other means than employer plans in the case of health coverage. In such circumstances, it's wise and just to support those accommodations, so long as accommodations and exemptions do not go so far as to permit some to violate what modern Americans have defined as basic civil rights or the achievement of other compelling public goals. These accommodations may well contribute to civic peace and heighten civic engagement, improving the prospects for many to lead fulfilling lives. The very diversity of modern America makes it reasonable to expect that many requests for distinct privileges will be confined to so few groups that they can be safely granted. Pursuing these policies would be conducive, moreover, to the flourishing of a wide variety of diverse civil associations of the sort that many have long thought to be America's best schools for citizenship. Such associations are often great venues for developing habits and practices of working cooperatively with others for the pursuit not just of individual self-interest, but of common goods. Through those pursuits, a wide range of cultural communities, from fundamental Christians, to militantly proud deaf culture groups, to persons of mixed race descent, to families with transgender members, may come to feel that they are all truly part of the larger American political community. And they might then work together to realize a vision of America as a multicultural but united nation which seeks to make meaningful enjoyment of the basic Declaration of Independent Rights possible for all. To be sure, accommodations alone would not be sufficient to combat the huge economic inequalities and unjust discriminations in modern America, and some might exacerbate them. Many ills need to be addressed by central governmental programs. Yet accommodations might mean that central governmental initiatives to combat unjust inequalities and meet human needs, like health programs and employment discrimination programs, would gain broader support because groups with different beliefs would feel their concerns had been heard. These then are steps that might make a more egalitarian, inclusive, multicultural America more politically viable. There are no guarantees of success, but if Americans make this choice, embracing and extending the Declaration of Independence story of American peoplehood, their course may provide examples that can aid similar yet suitably distinct efforts to resist the rising tide of exclusionary nationalism that now threatens to engulf us in many lands around the globe. Thank you. Sorry to be long-winded, but this is something I think is pretty important and I'm pretty passionate about.
Now, I'm hearing somebody calling, is it Thomas Perez? No. Keith Ellison? No. No, I thought maybe they were trying to reach Rogers. So you don't know who they are? Thomas Pence is now the... Okay, and he defeated Keith Ellison, who was supported by Bernie Sanders. Here's my question. I find many of your recommendations persuasive. And at the same time, you have noted that your policies have not been high on the agenda of major sources of political power in the United States. So my question concerns civic identity and political power. On the one hand, it does seem that there has been a coalescence of forces around a kind of left internationalism, or maybe even corporate internationalism, and on the other hand, sort of a right nationalism. And in between, there is a third way, which in some ways you articulate, a liberal but differentiated and democratic political identity. But that third way rarely achieves political power. Now, you've articulated many reasons why this has been the case in the United States. But I wondered if you have thoughts on why might it be that the ideal you articulate is so readily broken into partisan divisions that don't honor the best possibilities of liberal and democratic and differentiated citizenship. Rather, they break into ideological camps that don't speak to each other. So why is this third way, do you think, so difficult to find, why is it so difficult for this third way to find traction? And how might, the second part of the question is, how might narratives and rhetoric serve as levers for elevating your project of civic identity that you have so well presented to us tonight?
Well, first, I think building coalitions for progressive change is always difficult, but it is important to recognize through American historical experience and experience elsewhere that even positions which seem marginal at one time can eventually come to power, for better and for worse. The anti-slavery constitutionalist position that I discussed was very marginal when first articulated, and it came to power. We have, over the past more than a generation, sought to make white nationalist positions in America very marginal, and while they haven't officially come to power, they have come closer to power than I think many expected. The fact that we are in a period of great frustration with the established leadership of both parties, and I would say for many good reasons as well as bad ones, that makes it a time of danger but also opportunity. Now, why hasn't there been a kind of coalescence around the and coalition building around the sorts of positions I've described already, since versions of them have been advanced? As part of the answer is that they are very difficult political judgments, which affect people's interests and identities in conflicting ways. So agreeing as to what policies should be uniform, what differentiations are appropriate, these are controversial, inflammatory issues that it is not surprising often lead to more division than unity. But that is why I think that you need to undercut the wrestling with those differences. You underpin the wrestling with those differences, I should say, by a sense of a deeper shared common endeavor, and that you require some shared narrative of community identity in order to support that sense of shared endeavor. That narrative will always be contested to some degree, but if you have a shared sense that we are trying to get to the same place, we just have different strategies about how to get there, that is a better basis for accepting reasonable compromises and accepting that if you lose now, you may win at a later day, than if you think you just have nothing in common with the opposition. And I do think that because of an understandable, in many ways commendable wariness about telling stories of national identity that might be used for narrow chauvinistic purposes, that progressives have shied away from telling very compelling stories of shared purposes. Barack Obama did it initially better than any other modern politician, but he didn't give enough content to the story. His story was that we began with the Declaration of Independence and were involved in a quest for e pluribus unum. He would say this over and over again. His was an e pluribus unum story, out of many, one. But he didn't have an account as to what brought together this many into the one. I think, and he acknowledged himself when he was running for re-election that he hadn't told this broader story of purpose very effectively. I thought his second inaugural did it better than any other modern major speech, but Hillary Clinton did not articulate this story, from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall story nearly as clearly, as compellingly in the campaign. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, including her inherently technocratic nature, but I also think that there's a real reluctance to do, which I've shared, as I said, to do anything that seems as potentially imperialistic as putting forth a strong story of national identity. But the very fact that America First vision can have such appeal for significant numbers of Americans, not all Americans, maybe not most Americans, but enough Americans to put Trump in the White House now, shows, I think, that there is a broad longing for this kind of shared narrative, and with some sense of shared narrative and shared endeavor, even the very difficult kinds of policy questions I'm raising might be negotiated well enough not only to hold things together, but to create a shared sense of progress.
Okay. Questions? I guess it's left to me to choose who shall speak. Okay, I have a microphone here, and I'm going to give it to you because you're closest to me, and then to two other people whose hands I see, 1, 2, and then and then 3, and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Okay. Thank you for your passion. Demographically, non-whites, non-straights, I'll call them, are a minority, right? A question in my mind is, if you look at the white majority in this country, you have a lot of women, and yet somehow they identified enough with the Trump story rather than the Hillary story. Can you talk about that, the role, and how that got involved?
Can you talk about that? You have more authority than I do on this particular topic. It's true that white women voted for Trump. It's not true that non-white women voted for Trump. That fact alone does underline something that political scientists were reluctant to acknowledge before this campaign. Political scientists tended to assume that basically people are voting their pocketbook, and if you look at their pocketbook, you get a pretty good predictor of results. But the truth is that if you look at racial and religious identities, you get even stronger predictors for how they vote. And the racial polarization of voting has been increasing ever since the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, some measures that said that the Democrats would lose the South for a generation because white voters would flee to the Republican Party. They did do so. That included white women voters, and so those racial and religious bases of the modern conservative coalition and that Trump has now drawn to his insurgent position, that is a big part of the story, I think. That is, in short, people aren't voting gender as much as these other kinds of cultural commitments, if you will, to use polite language. Beyond that, I do think that Hillary Clinton's potential to mobilize women to support her was undercut because she did do a number of things that made the charges that she wasn't really trustworthy and wasn't really forthcoming to the American people credible charges. She really did give a lot of speeches for a lot of money on Wall Street. She really did refuse to tell us what those speeches were about. She said using the email, private email, was a mistake, but she didn't dispel the sense that she did act in a privileged way a lot of time. And so if you're a woman who, for any number of other reasons, including your partisan affiliation, go in with a little suspicion of Hillary Clinton, she fed those suspicions, and that meant that women didn't rally around her to the degree that certainly she needed.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this tremendously, and I wish that this could be heard by everybody. And I think one of the ways when you speak about telling the good story, telling our story, it needs to really begin in school, on an elementary school level, in junior high school. And I'm just struck recently, for example, I don't know if any of you have saw the movie Hidden Figures. Now, Hidden Figures to me is a perfect example of a narrative I had no clue about, and learning about that was really very important for me to know. Same thing, just for an example, years ago I visited Cambodia. I was clueless about the Khmer civilization. I'm just saying in general, you know, the narrative that we are taught, I think, needs to be changed. And I think that attention needs to be paid to that. And I don't know what kind of policy gets created in education. I'm not optimistic with a Betsy DeVos, but you know, I think that I'd like to hear what you think possibly could be done on that. And the one other quick question I have, I'm late to the party. I just read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic about reparations, and I found it so incredibly moving. Again, now maybe I'm dumb and naive and everybody else has come to this party before I have, but when I read about how this population, you know, African Americans, have been cut out of the ability to accumulate wealth because of redlining. I mean, these things that go back so far but still have such a profound effect. Do you think that there is ever a hope for reparations? Obviously not in this climate now, because people don't want to give anything to anybody, and let alone reparations. But I'd love to hear what you think about the concept of reparations. I do believe in them. I would be willing to have money paid from my taxes to somehow go to some sort of program. I don't know what that program would be.
Well, first on the issue of education, I agree with you very much, and have put more and more of my efforts in recent years to working with different kinds of civic education programs with K through 12 teachers, with public libraries, and with other such initiatives. And I want to, the Betsy DeVos reference is a very important one, because we face abandonment of a 150-year commitment to public education, to schools for all, in which people, the ideal is that people from different backgrounds mix and develop some sense of shared civic identity. And we're moving towards privatization of education, and that will reinforce the feature of modern media that everyone is rightly concerned about, which is that people only talk with those who share their own perspectives and views. If you're going to simply to your own private school or homeschooling or parochial school, if most of the population is divided up into those kinds of education, then there will be much less fostering of shared civic knowledge of each other and civic understanding. So I think that the battle to preserve public schools is a crucial one for the kinds of concerns that you raised. As for the reparations argument, I will confess that while I think Coates' analysis of the policies and conditions that have created the enormous racial inequalities in this country is completely compelling, I have been wary of the reparations language because it's open to the argument that, well, reparations is a legal term and you're supposed to calculate the damages precisely in relation to the harms imposed on the person, and it's enormously difficult calculus to find out what reparations should go to what persons. And once you get into that debate, you've moved away from focusing on progressive policies. And what's more, reparations has a backward-looking focus that I think is less useful for coalition-building purposes than a forward-looking focus that thinks of assistance to disadvantaged groups, whoever they are and whatever their reasons for disadvantage, including racial discrimination. That may be a good reason. I think it is a good reason for giving priority to such groups in governmental assistance. But I think that governmental assistance is best understood as an investment in bringing everybody into the ability to enjoy rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and creating a country in which all communities meaningfully can enjoy those rights. An investment in the future we're trying to build for all of us. I think that that has more political appeal. But having said all that, if a call for reparations actually works to get support for investment to aid disadvantaged, discriminated against communities, I'm for what works.
We have time for 2 more questions, and then, by the way, 3, and then there'll be a reception right nearby.
I want to make it clear that I'm referring to American citizens here, not to immigrants or illegal people or visitors. But you spoke about certain individuals who are making political statements for a white America.
Yes.
And they really believe in this. They're very outspoken, and they have a following. But American citizens are made up of every color, every nationality, every background. What do they suggest is going to happen to people who are Hispanic or Black or Asian? In other words, if they're American citizens, are they going to throw them on a boat and send them off or put them in a prison? I'm a little unclear as to, it doesn't seem rational what their argument is.
I think it's fair to say that their argument is driven more by emotion than by rationality. And I agree with you that the reality is that America is ineradicably a diverse society with citizens from a great variety of demographic backgrounds. But what they are hoping for is, at a minimum, to restore an America in which power and resources are predictably distributed most extensively in white hands. And that's the way it already is in the country. They're worried that we'll lose that, and so they want policies that protect and advance white interests at the expense of the others. The others will still be here, but you know, if they don't have a lot of political power or avenues of economic mobility, then they're useful for, you know, raking the yard or something. And so they don't need to send everyone away. This is a struggle for power fundamentally, and for policies that will keep them in power. That's why battles over voting rights is such a big part of the current struggle. It is an effort, these movement for voting ID laws and other kinds of restrictive laws, including making registration tougher, including making access to polling places tougher, and including districting. All these are efforts to structure our electoral arrangements so that even if a majority of the population becomes non-white, the great majority of the voters will remain white and power will remain in those hands. That's the kind of battle that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, thanks, Rogers. I'm really delighted you came, and it's always great to hear you speak, and it's very convincing. And in some ways I feel complicit because I've sort of argued your line a lot, but every time I hear it more and more,
I read you.
I get more and more worried, though, because it reminded me tonight of Robert Bellah and Habits of the Heart, that there's these two competing narratives at the base of the American political system. One is more individualistic about how we might even collapse in psychobabble about how we each are out to get for ourselves. And there's an element of Trumpism that's very Ayn Rand, winner take all. It's just about getting your piece of the pie. And your arguing for the other tradition, the more Republican, inclusive, collective tradition from our biblical roots, our Judeo-Christian roots. And I think that's there. But in some ways, what you just talked about, voting rights, reminds me that more and more, I think it's not about the message. It's about the movement. It's about the power. And they have all the power, and it really doesn't matter what the story is. And a lot of people who voted for Trump, they may be associated with white nationalism. I know some of my students are here, and I'm teaching a course where we discuss that. But on the other hand, it seems to me a lot of people just want their piece of the pie. The whole thing has been entirely neoliberalized. It's really dog eat dog, winner take all, give me my piece of the pie. They don't really care about America anymore. They don't really care about liberal democracy. They just want to be able to get their piece of the pie. And I think the challenge for the left is not to come up with a better story about how we are all together, but how we're going to be able to address that kind of anxiety that people have.
Well, I'm open to hearing about alternatives, but I'm not hearing any very strong left alternatives, so I'm not persuaded that there's obviously a better way to go. And I will note that, look, Trump was elected by a coalition. Politics is always about building coalitions. His coalition includes some white nationalists. It includes neoliberals who see the world as struggle for winner take all. All that's true. But it's also true that the coalition that elected him got something like a little over 24-25% of those eligible to vote nationally. That's the vote that he received. About 3/4 didn't vote for Trump. Now, they didn't, only slightly more voted for Hillary than for Trump. A lot of people didn't vote at all, but my point is to say they have all the power, and that they're all committed to neoliberal, self-interested, winner-take-all. It's not an accurate description of the coalition. It's a description of the part of the coalition, and it's not an accurate description of who controls power in America today. Remember, after 2008, Democrats controlled both houses of Congress and the White House. Power is up for grabs in America today. There is a lot of contestation over power. There is a huge amount of dissatisfaction with Trump, even as there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction with the established leadership of both parties. There is a potential for coalition building. And again, if you think, well, we don't need a narrative of national identity to do, progressive narrative of national identity to do that, we need something else. Okay, again, I'm for whatever works. Tell me what it is. But my feeling is that this is an option that that liberals and people further left haven't been trying, and I think it's time to try.
Last question, please.
Hello. First of all, thank you for speaking today. I have a comment and a question. The comment was for the question that was asked earlier about education. When you mentioned specifically about the civic duties that students are being taught, from a very young age. And you also spoke about how they're surrounded by like-minded individuals and taught by like-minded individuals, especially if legislation gets passed forward where it becomes on the state level. Young kids, let's say, starting at the elementary school level, don't really surround themselves with like-minded individuals because they're not yet aware of certain issues. And putting civic duty aside and learning about America, you haven't really spoken about the education and awareness that they really receive as far as what's really going on in the world and what they should be aware of. Like you mentioned earlier, how we can say that the nation was founded by these forefathers who were able to break free from Great Britain, build this great power, this great military, and now we have this stage set for us. And then it's reinforced by this notion of history that they have, that they come from Europe, where they gave birth to philosophy, and they come from the Renaissance. On the other side, there's a lot of individuals throughout the history of America that come from that have African descent or Native American descent that were told simply they have no history. except for complete savagery. So I just want to know your opinion about that. And the question that I have is to the first question that you were asked when you spoke about marginal legislation. The question that I have is, what do you feel, in your opinion, can be done about the policies that are really being spoken about today? Because I feel they're more of marketable policies rather than actual policy. A lot of candidates that are running for power talk about social issues and things that are easy to get, headlines for and statements for the news, rather than actual issues that will deal, with real problems for Americans moving forward, and that's all Americans. And adding to that, it really takes attention, away from these real problems when you get people distracted by talking to them about fighting for contraceptives versus, real substantial issues for rights for people moving forward.
Well, I have to demur when you say right to access to contraceptives isn't a real issue, right. But I believe I'm in sympathy with the bulk of what you're saying. Certainly, one reason I got involved in civic education endeavors is that I was very concerned not only with the question of whether privatization of education will mean that people are in their homes or in their cultural enclave schools only hearing narrow range of viewpoints. I am concerned about that, but I've also been tremendously dissatisfied with the kind of celebratory stories of America and Eurocentric stories of America that get told in traditional American public education. And I know because I was raised on those stories, and a lot of my scholarship has been motivated by my awareness, growing knowledge of all the voices they left out and of all the things they said that simply weren't true. And so I agree entirely that we need an education that speaks to the experiences of all those who have inhabited these lands and shaped its destiny in different ways. And while I did note the history that allows Americans to tell a celebratory story of themselves, I also stressed that we have to understand that this sense of American superiority has been associated with policies of enormous injustice towards indigenous peoples, towards slaves, towards African Americans, towards religious minorities, towards women, towards a long list of people through American history. And you're not teaching American history if you don't teach that story. Now, we have a complex and conflicted history. The reality is that a whole variety of movements, workers' movements, women's movements, African American movements, movements of religious minorities, they have used the Declaration of Independence and this sense of shared purpose to champion their cause. Philip Foner had a collection many years ago, Declarations of Independence, in which he showed how all these different social movement groups had used the Declaration of Independence for their purposes. And it's also important to understand that it has that potential. But if you just tell a Declaration of Independence story that celebrates America without paying attention to what the chief drafter of the Declaration was up to in most of his private life, then you're not telling the story of America. And on your second point, it is an enormously frustrating feature of current politics that while politics never has been and never can be a realm of truth and purely rational investigation, this is a theme of Plato's Republic that remains true throughout human history. It's also true that one of the consequences of certain ways of democratizing our political system with primaries accompanied by the rise of mass media. One of the perverse consequences is that we have moved into soundbite politics in which whether a professed policy resonates well when it's tweeted matters more than any kind of serious reflection on that policy. And it does diminish our capacities for self-governing that these soundbite politics have such appeal. One of the significant, though disturbing, features of the last election is that, you know, I think Donald Trump came to a lot of his signature positions simply on crowd reaction. You know, he just threw it out there. And if they went crazy, that became a Trump position. He's been marketing his whole life. That's what he does. And he also discovered, however, that he could use his tweets and his rallies as an alternative means, getting around the mainstream media to communicate to his people what he wants them to hear, which is what they want to hear. And it is a cycle in which resonating sound bites become the currency of politics. I don't want to be apocalyptic about it. To some degree, that's always been true. But we are in circumstances now where, in some ways, it seems more that way than ever before. And whether it will remain so, or whether Trump is a kind of unique phenomenon, is one of the big questions I have about American politics going forward.